Hi, it's Simon here, and just before we get into the episode, we really need your help with something. We have a survey out that we'd love you to jump on and do. It's all about life and faith, and if you're listening right now, you are the perfect person to do this. The survey won't take long, probably about 5 minutes, and it would help us a lot as we shape life and faith and think about how we can do it better. The survey will be running till mid-November, so if you have a few spare minutes, go to the show notes to click on the link or go to the CPX website, publicchristianity.org. Now, for those who do, there will be the opportunity to win what I think is a fabulous prize. So thanks for your help. Now to the episode. This week on Life and Faith.
You've got to pursue stuff, and the CFMU stuff is really a case of us pursuing what was pretty rampant corruption and wrongdoing that was hiding in plain sight, and I think it had been normalised in parts of our society.
They'd kind of been given instructions, and their mission was to find and kill all Tamil boys and men.
Conspiracies happen, and theories about them cause problems.
Populism is a sort of cry for recognition.
It's just a really, really good story.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. My guest today has made a significant mark on life in Australia, and I'd go so far as to say he has helped to make us a better country. Nick McKenzie is perhaps the preeminent investigative journalist in Australia. Nick has covered the local mafia, allegations of war crimes, Crown Casino's links to criminal figures, political donations by Chinese interests, national security issues, foreign bribery by the Reserve Bank and other companies. And most recently, he uncovered corruption in the CFMEU, Australia's main trade union in building and construction and other things. He discovered links to bikie gangs, routine violence, standover tactics and intimidation, and other unsavoury practices. And that work has brought about significant changes in the union. If Nick McKenzie calls your phone, your hope is that he's ringing to wish you happy birthday. You don't want Nick McKenzie coming after you. He is relentless in pursuing stories that uncover corruption, injustice, and individuals and corporations that mistreat powerless people. His pursuit, alongside veteran journalist Chris Masters, of stories of alleged war crimes committed by the elite special forces, the SAS, focused on Australia's most decorated war hero, the Victoria Cross-winning Ben Roberts-Smith. In uncovering and writing about war crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan, McKenzie and Masters challenged our view of ourselves and who we are as people. When Ben Roberts-Smith launched the defamation case of the century against McKenzie and Masters, it pitted two huge media companies against each other. It tested our court system and placed immense pressure on people who risked enormous amounts to come forward to tell an inconvenient truth. Nick McKenzie wrote about this experience in his book Crossing the Line, the inside story of murder, lies and a fallen hero. He spoke to us from Melbourne, and my first question was what he has learned about human nature, given that he has seen some of the best and the worst of what we are capable of. Here's Nick McKenzie.
You could spend a lot of time wallowing in all the badness that we confront. I like to say, people ask me about my job. I always say I'm not going out of business anytime soon, given the amount of villains running around. And to that extent, we see the worst of human nature, be it greed, ego, quest for power, selfishness, all those old cliches about how the concentration of wealth and influence and power leads to corruption. Yet countering all that is this constant reminder that humanity, truth, compassion is out there as a counterbalancing force. And there's all these great people who don't like bad stuff and stand up and take huge personal risks, often not only risking their career or their safety or job, putting it all on the line to do the right thing. In fact, there's a guy in the SAS who stood up to war crimes, and he just had a phrase which stuck in my head. He called it doing the righty, doing the right thing. And you said that all the time as a reporter, and it does fill you with inspiration. And it's a reminder that people really care about improving the world. That's why journalists are in business, because there's brave people out there who want to make the world a better place and know the media has a role in doing so.
And Nick, have you seen shades of the good and the bad in the same person? Like there's sort of shades of grey.
I mean, of course, it's almost a cliche. Well, it is a cliche to say that there's good and bad in everyone. That said, there's bigger doses of bad in some people. And I think, unfortunately, I've seen people who are, I mean, the word evil is a really strong and unpleasant word to use, but there are people out there who are evil.
Mm.
And I guess you temper it by saying perhaps it's not their fault. It was because they're born a certain way. There's a genetic makeup, or it's the way they've been raised by parents or a parent. And they're infused with psychotic or narcissistic tendencies which make them think the world revolves around them. Those people exist. And often they're people that investigative journalists expose because they end up, unfortunately, being CEOs of some companies, or they end up amassing power in politics. It's that quality, that single-mindedness, which allows them to advance in life. But it also is their massive weak spot and means they'll do things without a second thought. So rather than the question, is there good and bad in people? Yes, there is. A more perhaps interesting question is, is there good in really bad people? And how do you bring out that good? How do you connect with that part of a person? And then I think the other interesting question is really good people who are conscientious and moral, have a set of values, whether it's a personal set of values through their own belief systems, whether it's through attachment to a religion or whatever it is. These are people who devote their lives to being good. And yet, why do those people do terrible things that leave them racked with guilt? And then why do those people do those same terrible things over and over again?
Yeah.
And that's a much more interesting question. And for me, it's understanding that good people do bad things and then giving people a chance. And we do that as journalists because someone says, what I did, I was exposed an issue involving bribery that allowed illegal brothels to be kept open and potentially foster human trafficking, sex trafficking. And the corrupt official who was allowing this to happen because he was being bribed explained to me that he had a gambling addiction and he was deeply ashamed of his conduct. And we did the story, we exposed the wrongdoing, but we were softer, we were kinder, I think, in our reporting on this person, explaining the mitigating circumstances. And that was a case, I think, of a generally decent person whose personal decisions had made them do some terrible things.
Yeah, it's huge complexity, isn't there, in each of us, I guess. And you've seen that coming out in your work. Apart from the war crimes story, which we will come back to, I want to get to that in more detail. But apart from that one, what's been your most satisfying piece of investigative journalism that you've been involved in?
There's so many great thrills you get from investigative journalism. There's a great thrill in finding a hidden bit of information, especially if it's really hidden, and watching it sort of cut through the public consciousness and spark outrage or spark emotion or spark legislative change. But perhaps there's no greater thrill than giving someone who's never had much of a platform in their life, giving them a platform to tell their truth and to challenge power. And it can be the most ordinary person or someone who has a disadvantage in life or a perceived disadvantage, a disability that's kept them in the eyes of others back or whatever. And you give someone who hasn't had maybe a bit of a break, a big platform to tell a story, to challenge a wrong, and it can be utterly empowering for that person and their family. It can change their life. And that's when you see someone just glowing after that, feeling empowered, that's a really great feeling as well.
Was there something that inspired you in the history of journalism before you got into this that was a kind of shaping story for you that got you into it?
So I think there's something in your DNA that some people just have what I have, whatever it is. It's a mixture of many things. And I still try to wonder why I'm not someone who sort of takes a backward step when they see something wrong happening. I don't really know. I'm definitely not brave or anything. I don't, I'm certainly feel a lot of fear, but also I tend to, be the small things. If someone's doing the wrong thing on the tram, I sort of stick my head in and say something, even if about to cop a whack in the nose. And I think that applies more broadly to life. And why that is the case, I don't really know. I wonder, maybe is it, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Is there something about survival and fighting that's buried in my DNA? Is it to do with the way I was raised and some of the formative experiences in early life? It's made me want to challenge the status quo and challenge bullies and challenge those who abuse power. Whatever the case is, I want to do it and I like to do it and I don't fear doing it. And And I can be pretty single-minded about doing it. And I think that makes me a little bit different to other people in a good way and a bad way.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. You obviously, though, get both energised by this and very, as you say, it's sort of exciting. It's a bit of a rush, I imagine. It's interesting you reflect on your background with your grandparents and being able to identify with people who've been forced into positions of powerlessness against great and corrupt power. I'm sure there's something there for you.
Well, I think it's a really human emotion, though, when you see someone being stood on. It could be yourself, or it could be someone close to you, or someone you're vaguely aware of. But really rotten injustices, fire lots of people up. There's a point where you go, hang on, that's not right, and I've got to challenge that. And the nice thing about journalism, it's a platform to do that. It's a very imperfect platform. Journalism has lots of problems with it, but there's something quite magical as well. And the more you do it, the more you realise we need journalists out there, because there's so much wrong with our society, so much wrong with our political system, and so much wrong with our institutions of power, be they police forces, the defence force, churches. Wherever there's concentrated power in an institution, there can be, or there tends to be problems. Maybe not all the time, but certainly some of the time, or on occasion. And who's there to shine a light, if not journos? And what are journalists? I just see us as watchdogs for the people. And yet it's utterly exhilarating when you're on the hunt for badness, and you're breaking through into something, a corruption scandal, a police corruption scandal, a war crime scandal, a sex abuse scandal. It's also exhausting, debilitating. You get sued, you get threatened. It can be utterly terrible. And you can do all this hard work and no one pays any attention to it. So often you're filled with despair. And I think it's the really extreme highs and the massive lows. That's the roller coaster of investigative journalism.
Yes, and you've had some very high-profile, successful stories, but you must have had some where you just ended up deeply frustrated and unable to achieve what you'd hoped to set out to do.
Absolutely. I mean, so much of what we do is ignored, and maybe some would say for good reason, given the distrust in the media. The other thing that's difficult, I mean, you do make mistakes as a reporter. No one's perfect out there, and when you make mistakes that are avoidable, there can be a significant cost. But you want to be fair and you want to be just. And when you realise that perhaps you've taken a path where you just haven't seen something that you should have looked at, or it's a complicated area, you haven't examined every piece of the puzzle, and you've applied your journalistic power in a way that has left something not quite right, that's also very distressing. I find it so. And you carry that with you, because we do impact people's lives, and we try to do so fairly as best we can, but it's an imperfect science.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, because there are obviously some really great stories of uncovering very clear and obvious, once it's out, corrupt behaviour. But I wonder how you go about checking your own biases and ways in which you might be approaching a story and not getting it quite right. I think that's fascinating that you recognise that. Not everyone would have the integrity that you have in doing that. And there's been a lot of mistrust and some dodgy journalism over the years, hasn't there? And you've got that to contend with as well.
You use the word integrity. I mean, there's another word which starts with an in that's probably more important, which is insecurity. And I think when you doubt yourself, and I'm a big self-doubter, when you're worried so much about stuffing it up, and when you have parts of you that are deeply insecure, which I do, anxiety and other sort of issues that plague parts of my life, you care about getting it right, and you're worried I might have got this wrong. So you check and you check again. Now, I'm not saying they're healthy personal characteristics. I don't think they are, but they actually do make good journalism, because you're worried that you've stuffed it up. And also overlaid over that is the professional craft. I mean, we do know how to stand up information through corroboration. It's far more complicated than three sources makes it so. You're looking for primary evidence, you're looking for documentary evidence, you're looking for tape recordings, phone taps, anything you can get that actually says, I can call out this corruption, and what I say is true. It is as close to a fact, a verifiable, a corroborated fact as possible. And if you can show the public that you've gone through those steps, they'll believe it, and then the journalism has power.
We live in a time when media empires themselves can be thought of as sort of monolithic purveyors of misinformation and untruth. So people are less trusting of media now. What does that mean for the kind of work you're doing?
It really erodes the work that I'm doing because everyone, or lots of people, look at the media as one great monolith and regard it all with the same skeptical eye. Now, I think people should be skeptical of the media. It is a fact there is concentrated media power in this country that at times is very unhealthy. It is a fact that there are media moguls who prefer or privilege their personal interest above the public interest, and we see that play out in their publications. It is a fact that billionaire Kerry Stokes used his publications to advance the case of a war criminal. Media moguls the world over have clear, obvious problems, and that's so obvious it goes without saying. And there's all these other existential threats to journalism, that the financial model of our industry, the fact that advertising has run off to Google and Facebook, your Metas, etc., denying revenue streams to media companies and therefore denying money for journalism. That's hurt us as well. But all that said, people also want good stories. They want good journalism. They want their politicians held to account. They want to see them being held to account. And I think while that's the case, that journalism will flourish or at least continue to survive despite that mistrust and distrust. And I think skepticism is healthy. Absorb the media, but do it with a grain of salt and go, source a story from multiple outlets. You want people not just to be locked into one outlet. The real problem, though, is not just the mistrust of the mainstream media. It's the fact that people are getting their information from, non-mainstream, often conspiratorial outlets, and they're confusing what they put out with the truth. And suddenly when you consider that the major loss of trust in mainstream media, which ultimately tries to get it right, to tell the truth, and then sometimes an attachment to, fringe outlets that pose as truth tellers but are anything but, it gets pretty messy.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with investigative journalist Nick McKenzie. In this part of the interview, we focus in on the war crimes investigation and the huge defamation case that came out of that, which is the focus of Nick's book, Crossing the Line. I put it to Nick that when he and Chris Masters narrowed their focus onto Ben Roberts-Smith, it was on a highly decorated Australian warrior, Victoria Cross winner, and in many people's minds, the kind of archetypal Anzac hero. So why shatter that image for people? Here's what he had to say.
Well, as the blokes who served with Robert Smith said, and these are guys who went to war, fought alongside him, earned their own bravery decorations, protected civilians, shot dead Taliban and jihadists. As they said, the Australian public should, and most do, prefer a grim, messy truth than some sort of unvarnished lie. I mean, we're big enough in Australia, people are big enough and mature enough to say, well, yeah, some soldiers will do the wrong things. And in this case, it was the good soldiers who exposed the bad. And the bad are in the minority. Now, what they did is inexcusable. And Ben Roberts-Smith has been found by a court to be a serial killer. He murdered innocent people. A husband, a father with his hands handcuffed, who was kicked off a cliff by Ben Roberts-Smith. You asked the question earlier about evil in men. Well, there's no greater case study than a narcissistic, evil, psychopathic person. Now, what the public knew about him was false. It was a lie. It was propaganda. And the truth was brought out by actually soldiers, men that we can look up to and admire. The soldiers of the SAS who not only fought for their country repeatedly, but were good enough human beings to say, we don't kick innocent fathers off cliffs. We're not the Taliban. We're not ISIS. We're Australian soldiers. We have standards. We have decency. And really interestingly, there's a battle for morality inside every human being in every day of our life, right? We make small decisions, sometimes big decisions, and we apply as best we can a moral compass. Now, soldiers have to do that in the field, even though there's rules of engagement and international law that soldiers are bound by, and chains of command and very strict training. There's also an individual moral code in every soldier that fights. And what I think filled me with great admiration for the SAS of Australia, this Special Air Service Regiment and the commandos, were the vast majority of blokes there has a really good moral code, a decency that for me was actually stronger in them than in the average person I'd come across. And then we ask the question, if that's so, and I believe it is so, then how can some of them be more evil than anyone could imagine? That question I cannot answer, and it's a question that people have been asking for millennia, and it goes back to your earlier question, why do good people do bad things? And I often think of that great line by Hannah Arendt, the Holocaust writer, the banality of evil, and observing that the most ordinary people can do, in some circumstances, the most terrible of things.
Yes, and one of the things that comes out in your book is, while this is sort of bubbling away and becoming more of a story, there's this kind of tension between people who want to talk about the fog of war and the way in which you can't hold soldiers to certain standards because they're under pressure and snap decisions and so on. And you were trying to distinguish between that, which I think you concede is a real thing, but what went on here, which was sort of systematic, culturally terrible actions over time, repeated, and as you say, with terrible consequences on innocent people. But these are important discussions to have in this, aren't they?
Well, the whole argument that we were judging soldiers for acts carried out in the fog of war was propaganda pushed by Ben Roberts-Smith. Yeah. There was nothing fog of war about what he did. There's nothing fog of war about executing a man whose hands are bound, who has no weapon on them, and who's on their knees, shooting him in the back of the head. That's not fog of war, that's murder. And that's murder under international law, and that's also grossly immoral from anyone's perspective. That's what we were interested in. There were occasions where Roberts-Smith, I think, probably committed acts of gross murder in certain situations in Afghanistan, but we couldn't, because it was a more combat-like situation. We weren't willing to bring our judgment to bear. We didn't. We just ignored those instances and said, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt because it's happening in the fog of war, even though some of his comrades said, no, that's wrong. What you've just done there, you've just murdered someone. We kept a million miles away from that. Unfortunately, what happened is there is a big sort of cultural protection racket around elements of the Anzac legend, which Ben Roberts-Smith came to embody, where some people will say, under no circumstances do we ever question any soldier ever, full stop. Mm-hmm. And it's those people who then seek to confuse and muddy the waters by saying those doing the questioning of people like Ben Roberts-Smith are questioning acts done in the fog of war, when in fact it was never the case. And that propaganda persists right now until today.
At this point in the interview, I wanted to take Nick back to the morning of the 1st of June in 2023. He's waking up in his Airbnb in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and it's the morning of the decision to be handed down in the huge defamation case that Ben Roberts-Smith had brought against him and Chris Masters. I wanted Nick to reflect on what was at stake for him and Masters and many others involved in the case on that day.
There was many things at stake, and it sort of chills me even thinking about it. But I mean, it would have been probably the loss of our careers, which, so what, a couple of journalists lose their careers. But for me and Chris, it would have been pretty awful to personally endure. Yeah. But more importantly, it would have meant for all those whistleblowers, the truth tellers, the blokes who stood up for what was right in the field of war, who stood up to what it means to be a decent, brave, respectable Australian soldier. They would have also had their truths denied, and the truth would have been denied. It would have been a massive cover-up. So what was at stake was about truth in war and what Australia did at times in Afghanistan. And had we lost that battle, it would have been extremely depressing. The myth would have won the day. The narcissistic, psychopathic, bullying murderer would have triumphed. And it would have also told every Australian that money wins, that money always wins, because Kerry Stokes, the billionaire media mogul, was funding Ben Roberts-Smith's defamation case. And they were very keen to make sure Ben Roberts-Smith won the day. So, heading into court that morning back in 2023, I went for a run to try to expel my nerves beforehand as the sun was rising. And I actually will never forget seeing a double rainbow appear, which I took a photo of as I was running. I'm from Melbourne, but I was I had a tiny little shoebox apartment near Bondi Beach because I wanted to run on the ocean, and double rainbow appeared, and I took a photo of it as the sun was rising to our barristers. And I think I had posed the question, divine intervention, ? And then I leapt into the ocean. And it was the closest one of the closest times I've had to sort of trying to grasp a deeper spiritual connection, because you're trying to draw all the powers of the universe to back you in that day. If truth's not going to get us over the line, maybe a quiet nod from the one above might help.
Maybe there was something going on there. Andrew Hastie, the former SAS officer and now Liberal Party politician in federal parliament, who's been on this podcast actually, telling some of his story. He came out very admirably in your book, and he was one of a number of very brave people who stood up when it counted, actually at huge risk to themselves. Thinking about some of those SAS soldiers who you had worked with over years to try to bring them to this place of being able to tell this story publicly, what was uniquely theirs to lose as they did that?
For some of these guys, there was a sense that, and they became really sort of caught up in what was our fight, but it was also their fight. And for them, it was almost like this internal value system that had been challenged by what Ben Roberts-Smith did, that it had offended them so greatly that another Australian soldier, their comrade, had murdered innocent people, not in the fog of war, but in cold blood, for no reason other than he got a high from killing people or hurting people, and that he'd gotten away with it. It sort of offended their very sense of morality and their very pride in being an Australian soldier. They wanted to right that wrong. So for them, it was their very value system was on the line. They had decided they'd gone to war once, now they were fighting a war for the truth. And they were invested in it. And there was a cleansing for them when the truth came out. And I think the smarter people watching this, or indeed anyone watching it with open eyes, realised this was a fight between good, decent soldiers who, in the best tradition of the SAS, carry out their great work stealthily, quietly, and not seeking any admiration. It was these guys battling against this sort of publicity monster in Ben Roberts-Smith who sought relentlessly adoration, who wanted to be loved by the public and wanted all the money and the riches and the fame and the big job, despite the fact that it was all a lie and he was a monster. So there was a real reckoning for each of these soldiers, or many of them who wanted to stand up and tell the truth. And soldiers broke down in the box or afterwards. And again, it was for me one of the most compelling times of my life to see utter morality come to the fore, and at times an utter sense of shame that some of their, like a couple of soldiers, didn't stand up at the time or didn't stop events perhaps they could have. And this was their cleansing. This was their cathartic moment to say, I didn't do enough back then, but God Almighty, I'm going to give it my best now to make sure that if an innocent life is taken, if a murder occurs, then there is some justice and that evil doesn't triumph. It sounds like grand terms, but that was what was playing out. And I think our case actually restored some people. They made them more whole. They were broken men, some of them were. And I think standing up on their own feet and saying in court, no, this is what happened, this is the truth, like it or not, I'm going to make sure my value system embraces the truth and what is right, and not go along with the boys club, SAS, Ben Roberts-Smith twisted mentality. I'm going to stand up for what I think is right and wear the consequences. I think that was a freeing moment for some of the men who testified.
Yeah, we've done episodes on moral injury, and I feel like what you're describing is some degree of healing from moral injury that those men experienced. At one point in the story, when you were facing a very large mountain to climb in pursuing it, Andrew Hastie sent you a Bible verse. It was from 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And it said, be on guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous and be strong. I felt like that had a bit of an impact on you at the time.
Well, it's funny because Andrew would send me occasionally quotes from the Bible, and initially I'd disregard them. I'm not personally religious. But then as life got harder, and as this case got harder, I'd read them and draw inspiration, and I think what I saw in Andrew, in fact, why I respect him so immensely, is because he's a man not scared to live publicly by his value system. And it's a value system, in his case, informed by Christianity. However we inform our value system, we've got to have one as people. But, embracing it and embracing Christianity like he does nowadays is not cool. But he does so. And I think there's something noble and powerful about it. And I drew from his strength, and I did get a lot out of his urging me on. And I think hopefully he got a bit out of me urging him on, because there were times where he wavered. And I think there was times where he began to think, geez, what's going to happen here to me? And my political career is on the line. And it was absolutely normal. He had moments of doubt. He was the highest profile witness for this reason, because all the other guys had their names suppressed through national security orders. Yet here he was, former SAS captain turned politician, marching into court. The whole of Australia was watching everything he did. And, he had a media mogul in Kerry Stokes from his hometown of Perth, batting for the other guy. And for a guy who wants a political career as Hastie has and wanted at the time, that's a scary thing. And I flicked him back some of the same Bible quotes he flicked me, and sort of saying, forget all the noise. What's important here? And if I can circle right back, it's doing the righty, doing the right thing. And, at its best, that's what Christianity is all about. And I know it's what it's all about for Andrew as well.
Now, more recently, your work has uncovered corruption, bribery, connection to underworld figures and bikies in the CFMEU, which is a very large construction, among other things, union. Again, Nick, this is risky stuff you're involved in. Are you going after these cases now, or are they coming to you? Have you got to that point where people are just sending stuff to you?
You do get tip-offs, but you've got to pursue stuff, and the CFMU stuff is really a case of us pursuing what was pretty rampant corruption and wrongdoing that was hiding in plain sight. And I think it's been normalised in parts of our society. Construction, the sector affects us all. We know someone who works in, it's a huge employer. It's a massive economic driver. It affects us in the shape of our cities. It affects the cost of apartments. We as taxpayers pay for these mega projects that the union members of the CFMEU build. The CFMEU as a union is its power is interwoven with the power of the Australian Labor Party, and it controls parts of the party. It's such an important force in our society, and yet parts of that force were corrupt, were involved with racketeering, with organised crime and corrupt building companies. And we all knew it, or lots of people knew it. Now our job was to bring it to the fore.
Well, you did that, and a good result. Like, it's moving both individuals but also systems into a more healthy position, which I think is a really important part of your work. Now, finally, Nick, as you say, you're not a religious person, but as you're in this search for justice, do you see a kind of a spiritual reality to it? It's a bit of a fight against darkness, and I think you've seen plenty of darkness.
Of course you do, and you can't go through life. I think this is the great thing about getting a bit older and a bit wiser and experiencing things is at some point everyone looks to their own value system and asks themselves, sometimes, do I have one? And then it's, what is it? And how is it that I inform it? And some people will inform it through their church. Now, I'm not religious, so how do I inform it? So we inform it when we're raised. What our mum or dad, or whoever looked after us, tells us what's right and wrong. We inform it in the schoolyard. We inform it in our relationships and in almost everything we do, we're learning about what is right and wrong. And then building that value system as a part of who you are as a person, and then applying it, which is really hard because it's easy to fall into bad habits. But it becomes, in my job, so critical. Number one, we are throwing many stones, so unless you're willing, and I hate to use the biggest cliche from, but unless you're willing to look at yourself, I am not without sin. Of course, I'm just a human being. But unless I'm willing to excoriate myself, then I've got no place turning my blowtorch onto others. And yes, there's a Chinese wall between who I am as a person and who I am as a journalist. But who I am as a journalist is informed by who I am as a person. And unless I'm trying to live a good life and a values-based life and do the right thing and make the world a better place, then, I'm not going to be a good journalist. And I think that might be an unpopular view or an idealistic view or a naive view, but I actually think it's a critical thing. And I think it attaches itself to anyone in life. You need a value system, and you've got to work it out what it is, and then you've got to do your best to live by it. And, I strive every day.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. A huge thanks today to Nick McKenzie. Nick's book on the Ben Roberts-Smith story is Crossing the Line, the inside story of murder, lies and a fallen hero. I'll link to that in the show notes and to Nick's website, where you can see some of the incredible amount of work he has done in this space. Please send this episode on to someone you think might enjoy it, and there must be plenty of people in that category. And thanks today, as always, to our producer, the sagacious Alan Douthwaite. Next week,
There is a burgeoning interest in some kinds of history, like family history. Like there's this kind of yearning that we humans have to kind of understand like where we have come from, to ask, well, who am I really? Am I connected to any story which is larger than my own story?